In this chapter, we want to talk about how we bring this all together. It's a rather short chapter, and there was a part of me that didn't really want to include it originally. Just trying to kind of manage all of our workload. But I thought it was important because it all goes into this general idea that economists have, and I think that history kind of tells us a great deal about, which is how do you grow a developing country? Part of what we already talked about was having the banking system that you need. Part of it would be having this encouragement of specialization and whatnot. But the other part of what you need would be a transportation system, a well thought out transportation system that allows you to basically move not so much the people, but more so the goods from where they're produced, whether it's either manufactured or where they're grown, to the point to where they're processed, and then finally to the market. And that's kind of our point here. The economy cannot grow without a strong transportation system. Okay. When I made this lecture in the past, because I've chosen this textbook, I've chosen this chapter in the past as well. There's not very many of them, but there's quite a few economists who really, in my opinion, overemphasize the importance of the railroad um, in the growth of the economy. And while railroads are important, most of the market here is being shaped by water. Not only because it's cheaper, you don't really see a meaningful railroad in the United States until the building of I think it was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, and I think that would have been in like early 1830s. Let's see here. I know it was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. I don't think we get it until um, began in 28 and then operated 1830 to 1987. So even if we just kind of look at this map here of where it's all operating, you can see it's on the East Coast. So that would have been important. It would have been starting at a port city, and you would have had a good deal of operation there. Let's go back here. But the railroad, that if we're not getting that until 1830, and even then, it's not really large. Most of this work is going to have to happen via water. And so to grow this economy, we need a viable and reliable transportation system. Is going to increase productivity in the country, and it's also going to promote specialization because the railroad, the waterways are going to be what's moving everything all around. Yes, you do have people like traveling west, the actual people, but as you're spreading further west, you need these canals, you need these boats, you need these railroads that are doing the moving. And um, what's occurring is that as you build up the infrastructure, then regions of the country are building up their specializations even further. And what this is going to do is that it's going to reduce costs. And as you build up the infrastructure, it's going to reduce costs even further, not only for the products, but also it's going to increase the productivity. The cheapest way to really do everything is water. And the best way to show that to you would be from the textbook. And it starts off already really on page 146. And what you can see here is that really the railroad doesn't become meaningfully cheap in the entire 19th century. That water, for the most part, is generally going to be the cheapest way to move things. Yes, railroad rates do come down quite significantly as the system expands in the post-Civil War period, but water is still the cheapest. Let's go back over here. The other reason why this chapter, I think, in my opinion, is important is because what it does for us is, as I kind of said here, it's going to shape how the economy expands. It's going to shape the way in which specialization occurs. And again, it's going to be the spread. It's going to be the way that we become a stronger market economy. So all of these reasons are why just talking about transportation is important. But additionally, and this is not part of the slides, and AI didn't pick it as part of the slides, but it is an important part of this discussion, and that would be how we pay for all of this. Let me pause for a second here. The other reason, though, why talking about transportation is so important is because it brings up this important part of the debate about who's going to pay the money for this infrastructure. Is it going to be the private sector, the public sector, or some combination of the two? It wasn't entirely obvious. In England, which would have been the best example of a developed country at the time, it was entirely done privately. But the scale of what would be needed in this large country, the United States, was significant. And the banking system was still pretty underdeveloped. So it would be difficult for private investors to be able to get the money needed together. And so what we're going to see here in the US example, especially through transportation, is an early active involvement of the government and some supplement provided by private investors. And we see a great deal of this work being done as early as around the turn of the 19th century. In the early 1800s, the Treasury Secretary under Jefferson, Albert Gallatin, he was the one that pushed a great deal government involvement, especially the Congress, in the building of roads and the making of canals. And so that takes us pretty quickly to talking about one of the first kind of investments in the United States, which would be the Erie Canal. Let's look at what that map looks like, because the book doesn't even have that good of a map here. So let's just look at this really quick. Well, I kind of wanted the old map of it. Let's see here. No, it's good enough. Mm. So, well, you can kind of see it here, right? So it's going through about mid-state New York, basically connecting it with Lake Ontario and St. Lawrence Seaway. And then once you get down to Lake Erie, you've got a part going down in Ohio to basically get lots of grains and whatnot from Albany to the western end of the state, and then in the northern part of Ohio, all the way down to the Ohio River. Pretty important stuff, right? And this is all about the moving of grains. Huge investment, right? The Erie Canal as a whole is giving us a way to connect what would be essentially the frontier back in the first. So the Erie Canal opens in 1825. We don't get the railroads in this region until the early 1850s. So really the only thing we've got going here is the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which had been 1830s, 1840s. So 1825, this Erie Canal is really our first meaningful national form of transportation in the system. It's needed again for the movement of grains and the movement of things back to the East Coast, basically for export. And we can skip the slides into it. And I don't even know why they're showing that picture. That rate means nothing here. Again, refer to the book. Don't refer to this junky graph. And this was already repeated. I'd say this is a pretty bad AI generated set. of things. Why? It's showing a picture here of what looks like New York City, but it meant New York, the state. Because it's not going to New York City, the Erie Canal, it is going to, again, Albany out west. Freight traffic before and after 1830, this map has nothing, it's pointless. The words are, though, true. So let's focus on the words here. Is that again, the canal system becomes pretty important, especially for development in both New York, which is now becoming then the center of this transportation network that's canal based, and again, extending out to Ohio. And this was designed again to basically build up the East Coast even further, especially as the old colonies, now new states, are going to focus on their manufacturing. They need the new frontier states like your Ohio to be able to be bringing the goods um, back out east, and then manufactured goods to be taking out west. And so within these canals, you would see steamboats, much like this. This would come, in this case here, you've got the Claremont and whatnot, 1807. That would again be long before the canal, but it would be steamboats like this that would be operating on the canals. At the same time, too, Pennsylvania, and this isn't in the, I don't think is in the slides as well. I mean, so here's our discussion here very briefly about the Erie Canal, but it repeats what I just said. Erie Canal, built 1825. Yeah, I guess I somewhat agree with everything that's on this slide. But now they're going to miss a bunch here from slide 10 to 11. So let's talk about what's going on after slide 10 here. You've also got other things being built, though. The other things being built would be roads. And so we have a national road that's being built in West Virginia. And then you've got a toll road being built that's called the Pennsylvania Turnpike. Pennsylvania is also then building, besides building a road, it's also building a rival canal, which is pretty expensive and also doesn't make as much sense because the terrain is a bit more mountainous with the Appalachian Mountains than it would be for Ohio. But I think we have a bit, I'm just looking at the chapter here really quick here. Yeah, we will get to see. I mean, here, put this in the scale here. And I'll come back to this here. But you've got the Pennsylvania Canal, which largely fails. You've got another canal called the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, which is going from the Potomac River to Cumberland, Ohio, largely fails. All of these are being supported by the states because the states want to kind of build up this kind of investment to the tune of, get this, between 1815 and 1843, which is kind of our peak of canal building. In about that in about that 30-year time period, you've got $31 million in mostly state money being devoted to this. And there's not a lot of money being made. So there's not a lot of profit. You just have states thinking that canals are the big thing and putting a lot of money into it and trying to shape development. Then the reason why we're picking 1843 here is that there's a financial crisis. And when the financial crisis happens, then all the money kind of goes away for a little bit. Then the crisis goes away by the late 1843, 1844, and you get a second wave of the building of canals between 1843 and 1860. Ends in 1860 because you've got the Civil War, and that's where all the money's going to go. So you've got major canals. The major canal that's built in New York does largely succeed. But most of the other states, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Indiana, Illinois, went deep into debt to build these canals. And in some cases, it nearly bankrupted the states leading up to the Civil War. So get out of your mind this idea that 19th century economic development is all occurring via railroads. It's not. It's actually starting with the canals. And at least in the building of the canals, the early sentiment is that this needs to be paid for by the states. And the states are individually largely paying for this. But of all those canals being built, the only one that has any relative success would be the Erie Canal, which actually exists to this day. Not that we would take a field trip in this class, but if we were to take a field trip in this class, this would be the one to do. Now, the problem with canals is that you can only do certain size ships, but then the other weakness of these canals is that it matters which direction you're traveling, whether it be upstream or downstream. We can see this in the book as well. Well, here you get to just the idea that, again, in these two waves, 1815 to 1843, and then again 1843 to 1860, you're seeing this steady increase in the number of ships in operation and a dramatic increase in the amount of tonnage, right? The amount of stuff moving on these boats, either by boats near water or even just general waterways and canals, because the canals are going to basically connect the rivers. But the other, right into here, they're kind of showing you the first steamboat going down a river and whatnot. No, but here's what I wanted to show you. You're seeing this steady decrease in the upstream and downstream prices, but what also is important is a decrease in the differential between the two. This just shows you that basically Americans are becoming better and better at building the canal system, and that system itself is becoming more extensive. So what do you see here? It's becoming cheaper. And again, not as big of a difference between the two. So, if you're trying to save on cost, the cheapest way to move things would all be by canals. I don't think, let's just see if we have a good map here. I like a good map here. Let's just see if we have a good map of the canal system. Somewhat. Right, so here's our Erie Canal. Here's the Pennsylvania Canal. And you've got the one that was built out of Baltimore, which curiously enough, I'm guessing is right here. And then they're here. But really, again, what's the point of a canal? Canals connecting Lake Erie to the Ohio River. What's the point of a canal? Connecting your port in Philadelphia all the way across to the Allegheny River. I think that's the Allegheny. Well, the Allegheny is right here. I think this is another way of the Allegheny, though. But again, you get the point, right? Connecting cities to other major waterways that can then be used within your city. And so, sorry, because this is taking about 1825. We need a slightly older map. Well, geez, look at this listing. I mean, the Wikipedia entry is huge. I think this is naming all, it's maps all over the place. I just want a classic map. Well, there's the American Canal Society. Here we go. This would be a good map. There we go. So here's our Chesapeake and Ohio. That's a beautiful map. But yeah, here's our, if I were making the slides, this is totally the kind of slide I would have put in the book. I would have put in the slides myself. In fact, I'll try to do my best to remember to just steal this picture and put it in the slide, because it's really good. Most of these canals are going to fail. So 1860 would represent the end of the canal building period in the United States, and most of these canals will have failed except the Erie Canal and some extension of the Ohio and Erie Canal. Almost everything else is going to have failed. But again, what is it doing here, right? We can follow this, the Wabash and Erie, connecting the Lake Erie, the Toledo port, all the way down to the Ohio River, all the way down to Evansville, right? Why do you do that? Because now you can take this all the way to St. Louis. Connect that all the way down to New Orleans. Okay, let's go back over here. You know what? This is a good enough of a picture. Sorry, just watch. Let me do this while. Let's just live throw it in there. There we go. It's a pretty good one. You think AI is not smarter than me? I am smarter than it. Take that, AI. But again, you get the building of the railroads here, and you do see that as the canals are basically going to have to, as we're building the railroad system, we're going to have to combine the canal system with the railroad in some sort of synergistic way. When it comes to the railroads, again, we get the first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio. We get that in the early 1830s. And the idea was that these trains, which were already extensively located in England, that these could be quite useful in the United States. So we start building these, and there was a great deal of opposition to the trains. The belief was that these things moved too fast. Where would we even put them? And they weren't seen as dependable and much more expensive, certainly, of an investment than just using waterways and canals. So canals really did have the early advantage in the 1830s. But what the problem with canals and even with waterways is that you can only do things then as long as you've got water moving around. What you need, as much as you don't want to do it, you need to just start dramatically increasing your investment in railroad to be able to reach places that don't have a great deal of water existing. Even though we don't get the first railroads until the 1830s, by 1840, we have close to the amount of railroad mileage as we do canals. So the railroads do really take off quite quickly. Then when you've got that pretty bad recession in 1843 and the canal investments falls off, we do see that the rail investment continues to increase, especially in the north compared to the southern colonies. That ends up becoming important, especially when we get to the discussion of the Civil War, because the North had built up its railroad infrastructure extensively, whereas the South did not. And going back to the textbook, you can see this increase in the railroad mileage up to 1860. 30,000 miles. And this is even before the Transcontinental Railroad gets built in 1869, 1868, 1869. There are some issues with this infrastructure. As you kind of mentioned here in the textbook, you've got different gauges. The gauge would be the distance between the rails. So we don't have really of a standard gauge until 1860. Different railroads would be doing different things. You want to have it standard so that trains can travel across different networks. And what we see is that the value of these railroads is, look, it dramatically increases productivity. Look at that. There's where you're getting economic growth. Started with the canals, but the North is largely able to win, I would argue, and I think others would argue as well, is that the North is able to win the Civil War in part by having a strong railroad network. that increases your productivity of workers, which is important because people are dying. So you need these workers to be productive. But also what you're seeing is that you need, you win a war with the movement of goods, and these railroads are going to be able to do that um, pretty cheaply. And those railroads are going to also be financed in a rather similar way to the canals, except now instead of the state government, we're going to get the federal government involved. And the federal government is going to make pretty significant investments in the building of these railroads. Already by here, the chapter is ended, but I still have a bit more I want to say. The other part of this would be the national road system. I'm not sure what I'm going to see here. Yeah, it looks pretty close to accurate here. And so what you can see here is that for the most part, it starts in Wheeling. And this is all made with wood. It's like wooden planks and whatnot. And they would cut the forest, and basically you would just go across you would just go across the woods and take it all the way to St. Louis, because that's where you want to, again, move the stuff pretty cheaply. Vandalia, God, there's like nothing in Vandalia. Same with Terre Haute. Terre Haute's just got like a big prison. Um, all these kinds of cities of the Midwest, as you just kind of go through them, they all get their start with the building of the national road. And that becomes important too, but it's pretty costly to be moving things by road. So you don't really want to do it too much if you don't have to. Going back to the textbook also has this structure too, that besides the national road, you've got other kind of side roads as well, the Forbes Road, the Genesee Road, the Natchez Trail, and you've got this extensive amount of trails here that's being used mainly by settlers in their attempts to moving west. So these aren't used as much for goods as the roads are. The roads are being used more for goods than people. The trails are being used more for people than they are goods. So again, you've got the Cumberland Road, which is the national road, being a quite extensive road. Again, starting in the beginning, at least in Wheeling, and then going to the Ohio River, and then eventually going to St. Louis. Again, all this undertaken by Gallatin, who is the Treasury Secretary under Jefferson. These roads, some of them are being paid for by the government, but you also, most notably in Pennsylvania, you get the building of the Forbes Road. And the Forbes Road, if I'm not mistaken, is a paved road. I think it's a turnpike. Sorry. Looks like they're just looking at the old use of it as a military road because it was used in the French and Indian War. I think at later point there was tolls on the road as they were building it out further. But in any case, some of these roads, not the Forbes Road was, but in any case, some of these roads are actually going to become turnpikes. And the turnpikes become important because it's going to be one of the few examples of where it's going to be one of the few examples of where you don't need the government to get involved. There was a pretty notable toll road between Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and Philadelphia. Lancaster's about like right here. It's about what, 70 miles, 80 miles. I used to live just outside of Lancaster, and I didn't want to take the turnpike because it was too expensive. I'd rather take the real roads, the free roads. Obviously, that's not a choice back in the day. Besides then the roads, the only other thing that becomes important, certainly for this chapter, would be the ocean transportation. Now we had we had ocean transportation before, but what becomes notable is that we start to get more regular service um, between the United States and the markets that they're building, and those markets help lead to just cheaper prices overall, and they just build up the United States overall as a market where you can get a great deal of transportation. So again, why would I deal with this chapter, which only took 30 minutes of lecturing time for me? The reason why this was important is because what it does is it gets us into this debate of who's going to pay for the money, who's going to pay for things here. And largely, again, it's originally the state government and then later the federal government. But the private sector, largely a no. And that for the most part, what we're seeing is the building of canals where really most of the action is happening. And that the railroads really only take off in the late 1800s. And certainly after the Civil War, with the completion of the um, Transcontinental Railroad in 18, I think it's 1868. I think it's actually in our next chapter here. Let me make sure here. Let me just make sure here. I think it's 1868. Anyway, but we'll definitely get into it here in chapter 10. So some of those same themes we're seeing right now with the role of transportation in expanding the markets, that's going to be our point here in chapter 10, where we now talk about how up to the eve of the Civil War, the market is really able to expand. So this next chapter, chapter 10, is going to get us kind of continue our discussion of how the overall economy is changing in the United States leading up to the Civil War. And then in the final chapter of this second era of US economic history, we'll complete the discussion by talking about the money and banking system and how that also plays a role in the expansion of the markets overall in the United States.